Okay, I got it working. Okay, you can stop talking now. Attention, everyone. Okay, we are ready to get going. So, anybody in here worked with Docker before? Okay, a few people. So today's talk is going to be about Docker, specifically about how we improve the developer experience for one of our front-end web apps. Alternative title for the talk, Docker's Awakening DX, because Link's Awakening DX is an awesome game. My son was sitting on my lap earlier, so this is what he typed in for a title. I have no idea what this means, but he's a year and a half old, so I'll trust that he had good intentions at heart. Yes. So a little bit about me. I'm Dustin. I've been in Belingham for 6.5 years. I'm a senior software engineer at Olo, so I mainly focus on front-end web work. And if you've ever ordered Five Guys online, this is using the product that I built. So everybody go out and order Five Guys. Whatever orders you do, I get like a 5% cut. I wish it worked like that. But yeah, so we're in the process of making our. We have two web applications, desktop and mobile. The desktop one is super legacy. The mobile one is great, but it only has a mobile style sheet. So we're in the process of making that responsive and doing all of our volume. But right now it's just mobile. So other places you might have seen me around, I'm maintaining a .NET server-side rendering library for React. And I, as of 2 weeks ago, got into startup land. I created a new business, woke.dev, which all it does is redirects to Twitter sorted by latest because their top algorithm is trash. So you can try that out on your phone right now if you want. It works. So I'm up here today. I'm here to talk to you about slow builds. Anybody ever been at your workstation and you've got flow going on and you hit save and then all of a sudden you're looking at like 30-second builds? Super frustrating. And that was my first day on this project because everybody else on my team had Macs, and I made the mistake in the onboarding survey of saying, why sure, I want a Windows laptop. Well, it turns out for JavaScript development, not all of the build tooling is as excellent as it is on Mac. So for me, initial startup of the application took 30 seconds. So if the Ember server crashed and I had to restart it, I'd be sitting and looking at a terminal for 30 seconds. And even after the cache was populated, saving a file, I had to wait 6 seconds for the full module rebuild to happen and then reloading the page. If you've been doing Windows development and you're new to the JavaScript scene, 6 minutes is a pretty slow build. I know some people may be used to hit build and then go to the coffee machine, come back 5 minutes later, it's done. In JavaScript land, we usually use hot module reloading or other technologies to make it so like you hit save and your browser updates, it's really fast. So what was going on in our case? With Ember applications or React or Angular, you're typically pulling in a ton of third-party dependencies, and these live in the node modules folder. If you're using Webpack or Require.js or something like that, typically you're using Node's module system for that. If you haven't seen this satire article on Medium, it's hilarious, but there's a little bit of truth in it. Node modules has, I think I copied it from one external drive to another, and it took a half hour because of the depth of the file system, or of the depth of all the files in there. It wasn't that any one file was hundreds of megabytes. It was like hundreds of thousands of 10 kilobyte files. So the root problem here was the penalty in accessing hundreds of thousands of individual node modules, and Ember's build created a bunch of temporary files as a part of the asset build pipeline. So on Windows, it has a different file system design than Linux or OS X. And there's an additional penalty dealing with NTFS. I don't pretend to understand the file system internals really deeply. There are much smarter people than me out there who could tell you all about that. But for me, at least, and all my and Windows developers on other teams, whenever they tried to build our app, it was slow. And looking at Resource Monitor and other tools, we could see that most of the time it was I/O waits. It wasn't CPU bound work. It was time to disk. So our first thought was, okay, well, let's use the Windows subsystem for Linux. You know, Microsoft has put a bunch of effort into this space to making it so you don't have to run full-on Linux VM on your machine. Well, it turns out, if you go dig into this issue, the Windows subsystem for Linux uses Windows file system handles for all the files it creates. So even if you're in Bash and you're in your home directory and you do a git init and you create a bunch of files in there, if you dig into like Resource Monitor and look at what files are being accessed, you can see the file handles. It really is individual files on disk in NTFS, and they wrote this cool emulation layer there. But the problem is it's still NTFS under the scenes, or behind the scenes. So I did a little Googling around, found this issue. It had 66 thumbs up. Anytime you see an issue that's been open for 3 years and it has over 50 thumbs up, you're gonna have a bad time. So my first thought was, okay, well, what if we use a blockchain for this? Blockchain's supposed to solve everything, right? No, that was right out. What about containers? Containers are popular before blockchain. Maybe they can help us here. Yes. So we did a test on this. We spun up just a simple Node 8 container with Docker on my Windows workstation. And I cut our build times down by almost half for a fresh build, and rebuilds took 2 seconds instead of 6. And that was definitely an improvement so these numbers came from me preparing this talk 2 hours ago when I was on a battery. When I'm normally plugged in into the wall, my CPU disables the battery saving profile. You can usually get rebuilds under a second. Other benefits of using Docker, if you're new to the technology, it gives you a recipe for consistent build environments, and you can have multiple containers linked to each other and talk. So that's really handy. Okay, so just to recap, what we did was we created a container that copied over the entire Ember application to the containers file system, which uses ext4 or whatever Linux file system you're using to persist files to disk. And on Windows, all the Windows kernel sees is just a big block of a virtual hard disk image. So you've got like a 60 gig chunk of disk. It has no visibility into what's going on in there. It just sees a raw block of space on your disk. And so just removing that layer was the source of, that was the cause of a lot of our slowness. So removing that layer helped us out significantly. And so when you run Docker on Windows, I can probably pull this up. You're running, that's just Windows asking me if I really did want to do that. You're running Hyper-V behind the scenes. So it creates this VM, Docker Desktop VM. And if you dig into settings, you can adjust how much memory is there. Like I've got 4 gigs allocated here. You can see what virtual hard disk it's connected to, and you can set bounds on how much space it'll allocate and stuff like that. One thing we did discover through this, the Windows container support is very new, and you can run Windows containers and Linux containers side by side, but there is an added penalty in how it caches the layers that it's building. So to see these build improvements, we had to switch to Linux containers only until Microsoft fixes some of the speed issues around there. So if you're looking at using this for your own projects, make sure you're using Linux containers for this. But this introduced a new problem because we wanted to keep our developer experience really solid. So when you're doing web development, typically you'll modify a style sheet or you'll modify a component. It'll tab over to your browser, hit refresh, and you want it to just work. Well, with Docker builds, we now introduced at container build time, copy all the files into the image, build them, and then start it up. We needed a way to keep these files in sync. And with Docker, even if the files in the host volume change, it doesn't signal to the container that the change happened. So I did a little Googling around. Somebody wrote a Python tool for this. Somebody wrote a tool in Rust, another one in Go. There wasn't yet one for .NET. So I ported it over to .NET. And if you're using the .NET Core tooling, you can just run .NET install global Docker volume watcher. It'll pull down a build from NuGet, but if you want to look at the source, it's on my GitHub here. It's pretty straightforward. So what it does is it uses the file system watcher interface that Microsoft provides, and you point it to a location on disk and say, hey, I want to watch for any changes in here. As soon as it receives a notification from the Win32 APIs, it runs a shell command in the Docker container that does like a chmod or something like that to just signal to the container file system, hey, this file changed, and then it goes and rebuilds the app for you. And then the last thing we did here to improve our developer experience, we didn't want our developers to have to remember to run Docker in here and start this tool and make sure that Nginx is running and all of that. We just wanted them to open their workstations, run one command, and have it do everything for you. Since this is a JavaScript app, we already had build script, or we already had shell scripts in here. This is a snapshot of the package JSON manifest in our project group. And so the keys here define script names that you want to run. And then if you run yarn command or npm run command, it'll evaluate whatever you have as the value here. So we added a yarn docker start command, which just ran a PowerShell script that was checked into the repo. And then from there, it did a bunch of checks to start up Docker and make sure everything was consistent. That's all I have. So if you're interested in using Docker afterwards, or you have some weird edge case that you're curious about, since I've just worked in this space recently, it's all fresh in my brain. If you talk to me a month from now, I probably won't remember most of this, but love to talk to you afterwards. So that's all I have. Thanks. I am an Ember developer now, yes. Ember is not dead.